All right, everyone can hear me now. This is Herschel McWilliams. This is also Live Jazz KC and Convo Improvvo, another installment interview of the interview series we have here, hosted at livejazzkc.com. Thanks for tuning in. Again, tonight we are honored and pleased to be hosting John Stowell, wonderful guitarist, and per usual, our wonderful host, Rob Scheps. So again, like the last 9 months, nothing's changed. There's still no gigs, and we're finding ways to bring music to the listeners any way we can here at Live Jazz KC. And in doing so, we certainly appreciate any gratuities or tips or donations you could make to the musicians involved in the interviews. And that can be done either through Venmo, and I will put that information in the comment section, in the description of the video, as well as the comments, and or through livejazzkc.com/donate. And all those funds go directly to the musicians. So again, we appreciate you tuning in. I look forward to tonight. Great deal. It should be wonderful. I'll hand it off now to Rob Scheps and John Stowell. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Herschel. Happy holidays of various stripes, everybody. Hey, John, can you hear me?
Hey, Rob.
Hey, all right. So John is here in his hometown of Portland, Oregon, and I'm further away, but also in Oregon. And we go way, way back, but we'll get into that later. So, John, you came up in Connecticut, and you kind of have a lot of colleagues in jazz today who are about in your age group who also were growing up in Connecticut. And the guys I'm thinking of are Adam Nussbaum, Chip Jackson, and John Schofield. Can you clarify all of that?
That's all true. I met John Schofield and I'm slightly older than John is. And I remember actually once sleeping on his couch when he was going to Berkeley. He and Chip Jackson, was it Chip? No, it was Ted Siebes. And it could have been Chip Jackson. Anyway, John was at Berkeley. And we had been casual friends in Connecticut, and he was playing really pretty well already by his early 20s. And I remember at least one time sleeping on his couch a couple of blocks from the campus and just going to a couple of classes and sitting in. So I've known John for almost 50 years, and our paths still cross occasionally.
Okay, now, so which town are the four of you from? And is Ron McClure also one of the Connecticut guys? And finally, how far from New York City is this area?
Okay, Ron, I do not know his personal history, so that I couldn't tell you. But we all grew up in it kind of.
Sorry,
I think New Haven. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Ron, I've not had the pleasure of meeting, although I've known about him for years. Adam Nussbaum and I went to the same high school, Staples High School in Westport, Connecticut.
Okay.
And I think I probably met Adam right around then, maybe slightly later. Chip Jackson also went to the same high school, and John grew up in Wilton nearby. John Abercrombie also grew up in Greenwich, also nearby.
That's right, and he always he would always stress that John Abercrombie would stress that he did not grow up in the ritzy part of Greenwich, but in the working class part, which actually the neighborhood is known as Chickahominy, which sounds like a joke, but it's the real name. And he said that was
an Indian name.
We say, yeah, he said that was really more like working class Irish and Italian and Black and everybody kind of nicely mixed together. But okay. So the question is, wow, you went to high school with Chip Jackson and Adam Nussbaum. What a hell of a rhythm section that would have been.
Yeah, and we were all at that point. Actually, they got a little head start, and so did John Schofield on jazz. I came along slightly later in terms of my studying jazz. We can get to that a little later if you like. But I knew them all then, and I haven't seen Chip in many years. Adam and I've crossed paths a few times over the years, and John Schofield I've seen a few times on the road over the years too. And they're all still very nice, very approachable.
So regardless of who was a little older or a little younger, you're saying they all kind of came to jazz a little earlier in their lives than you did.
Yeah, I'd say at least a couple of years earlier.
Okay. And, of course, in any bio I've ever seen on you, John, it always comes up that you had a very well-regarded teacher, I guess guitar teacher in Connecticut. Was it Link Chamberlain?
Yeah, he is. And he has a reputation beyond Southern Connecticut, although he was quite well known there. He could play all kinds of styles. Mm-hmm. When he played jazz, it sounded a bit like John McLaughlin, very dense, very busy sometimes, but he really knew harmony. And he also could, he could transcribe a Wes Montgomery solo. Mm-hmm. And I still use some of the concepts that he gave me then. So I still credit him at workshops and clinics. His approach to some of the modes of the melodic minor, for instance, I still use and I still credit him. Sure. And his son, Scott, actually was a good young tenor player as a teenager. And I met Scott then, and I hadn't seen Scott in about 45 years. And about a year and a half ago, we reconnected for a little gig in Connecticut.
Wow.
And I, told Scott how much I really appreciated studying with his dad. And through Link, actually, Link did a couple of records for Muse. You can hear one with Dave Liebman and a rhythm section, and another one actually with David Friesen and Gary Hobbs, two Northwest musicians. I introduced David to Link, and they played a bit together.
Okay, well, excuse me. Let me jump in here. How old were you? We just saw a picture of Herschel's beautiful child, Vivian, with her brand new Christmas pink guitar, but she's only 4. How old were you when you started playing guitar, John? And was it your first instrument? And either way, why did you choose it?
I didn't really choose it. I started actually probably my oldest friend, because she was hired by my mother to be my babysitter when I was about 4. So when I was about 9 or 10, she put a ukulele in my lap and I started strumming on that. And then by about 10, so slightly older than Vivian, I started strumming chords. And the first 8 or 9 years don't really count because it was rock bands. Although I loved music, I wasn't particularly good and really wasn't studying. So for someone who wanted to be a professional musician, I got a late start.
Are you talking about basically late 60s, early 70s when you were playing in these rock bands? So
that's right. Yeah.
Were you guys playing covers? You were playing, rock and roll top 40 hits? Like what kind of music?
Let's see. How did I start out playing? I actually liked some of the experimental English bands when I got into my late teens, like the Yardbirds, like what Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page were doing, which wasn't jazz, but it was definitely extended improvisations and something other than 2 or 3 chords.
Right.
And then the Grateful Dead. And then from there, I sort of transitioned to things like Bitches Brew and some of the earliest fusion jazz. And then I realized I really wanted to play this music and had to study it. So that's when I approached Link Chamberlain.
So interesting. So hearing Bitches Brew, when you were kind of busy playing rock bands with your buddies in Connecticut, was John McLaughlin one of the first jazz-related guitarists that you got hip to?
I'd probably heard Wes and a few other of the mainstream guitar players before hearing McLaughlin. So I had heard a little bit of jazz before Bitches Brew, but I think a lot of us who came from a rock background got pulled into jazz from hearing some of that early fusion, from Weather Report, Miles, Chick Corea, et cetera. So that pulled a lot of us in. And I remember hearing some of those groups live. I heard Miles live a number of times then.
You did?
Did you hear Miles? Yeah, I heard them live.
Did you hear Miles in Connecticut or in New York City or where?
No, I heard him at the bitter end one time. So they've just taken the roof off the place, rock volume, Dijonette banging as hard as he could on the drums, Dijonette and
at the bitter end on Bleecker Street. That's kind of a small
bitter
club.
end. It's a small club, and they were playing loud rock volume. So Chick and Keith both on electric keyboards. Miles playing the trumpet through a guitar amp with a wah-wah pedal. His trumpet sound at that point was kind of gnarly and angry, but the music was pretty interesting. I heard him a few times then, and one time in Connecticut.
I never knew that was a guitar amp that Miles was playing through when he played electronic.
Sometimes. When the group was really loud and electric, and then I think he got back to his more conventional sound later on after his comeback when he came back in the in the early 80s. But in the early 70s, not on Bitches Brew so much, although he had a little bit of echo and some effects on the horn, but live right around that time or maybe a year later, he was heavily amplifying the trumpet. It was not a particularly pretty trumpet sound, but all this wonderful, dense, swirling harmony pulled us all in.
Well, you heard the band with Jack and Chick and Keith, and I'm thinking that's around 69 or 70, but did you hear I guess Miles transitioned from having piano-based bands all those years with Red Garland and Herbie and everybody, and he really didn't use guitar players. I mean, at the end of the 60s, he would sometimes add George Benson or Joe Beck to his famous quintet for about one tune. And what a lot of people don't know is there's a song called Fun, not to be confused with Big Fun, which is actually Wayne, Herbie, Ron, Miles. Who am I leaving out? Herbie, Wayne, Miles, Ron, Tony, with Bucky Pizzarelli. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh wow, that I did not know. But I think is it Paraphernalia? What's the tune that Benson's on one of those records from the late '60s, mid to late '60s? That's quite a nice solo too.
Well, what I can tell you is there's Water on the Pond with Joe Beck, and Paraphernalia, or maybe the song is called Stuff, but it's from the record Miles in the Sky. Benson's on that. And
he sounds great.
I had to go onto YouTube and look for this, but the song Fun is the classic Miles quintet with Bucky Pizzarelli. And given that Bucky was about 93 when he passed away, I think last year, it's, chronologically very strange to think of Bucky Pizzarelli with that quintet, but he fit. He's a good musician, of course, and I guess Miles had something that he wanted to get from Bucky. But so I guess my question is, did you then hear some of the Miles bands with electric guitar when he started switching from pianists and keyboard players to guitar players, like the band with Pete Cozy and Reggie Lucas?
I didn't hear any of that live. I heard some of the recordings, But I think I stopped hearing him live probably in the 70s for no particular reason, maybe partially because I was out here by the mid 70s and he wasn't out. I don't know. I'm sure he played Portland at some point, but I never heard him on the West Coast, only on the East Coast.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm certainly aware of the guitar players that have come through his bands over the years. Absolutely.
I don't think it was you, John. I think it was our friend who's just a bit older than you, John Abercrombie. I think John would be, oh God, I guess he would have just turned 74 or 75 a couple of weeks ago. And I think he's the one, not you, who told me that when he was at Berkeley, because you didn't go to Berkeley, so it must have been John, right?
No, I did
John,
not go to Berkeley.
John Abercrombie told us that Wes Montgomery came to Berkeley and gave a master class when he was a student there.
Oh, wow.
Did you hear about
interesting.
that? And John,
and Wes,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say Wes he knew a little more theory than I thought, because there's some video of him on YouTube of an open rehearsal, and they knew that it was being filmed, obviously, because there were cameras and microphones. Really good, I think a Belgian trio, although Han Bennick was on drums, and Han is known as a free jazz drummer. When he was a kid, he sounded like Louis Hayes. He was a swinger when he was young. But Wes is saying to them,
we played with Dolphy. I wasn't aware of more straight ahead.
But he's just right in the groove with these guys, and I don't recall the name of the bassist and piano player. They were very good. And Wes was just talking through some chromatic changes, a reharm on End of a Love Affair. And Wes is saying, yeah, there's a 2-5-1 here. And I thought, Wes knew some. I knew he didn't read, but he knew some theory. Clearly, he knew some.
Well, I asked John about that clinic, and what he told me was, he said Wes was the nicest guy in the world. He came and listened. John said he came and listened to our little guitar ensemble coached by Jack Peterson, who was John's, I think, most influential early teacher, and I think he's still alive. And he's in his 80s.
He is. He's in Arizona in his 80s and still playing well. That's right.
Great, yeah, and John also said, he said Wes was the nicest guy in the world, and then he just kind of had an ashtray and chain smoked, and back then, whatever that would have been, let's call it 1967, 68, that the concept of a jazz musician coming to a music school and giving a clinic was not really that common at that time.
That's right. Everyone I've talked to, and you can see in this rehearsal footage, said Wes was a total sweetheart, very unassuming. In fact, Nancy King, who we'll get to at some point later, who's a good friend of both of ours, consummate singer, lived in the same building as Wes about 1961 in San Francisco, and she'd hear him practicing in the morning and said they became friends. She would be sitting in with Coltrane, and he used to sometimes leave an extra bottle of milk for her because I don't know if he had his kids with him, but he knew that she had kids. And she said he was a sweetheart apparently.
Interesting. And that's just a real aside, but most people don't know this, but the John Coltrane Quartet, the famous group with McCoy and Jimmy and Elvin that we're all aware of, John Coltrane invited two people to join that band, neither of whom did regularly, but did do some live gigs with the band. And those were Booker Little on trumpet and Wes Montgomery on guitar. Those are two of my favorite musicians, and I wish that I could have heard them with Coltrane.
Well, Nancy heard them, not Booker Little, but Nancy heard Wes sitting in with Train. And I think at that point, Train would be doing 20-minute versions of My Favorite Things or lots of long modal things. Although there's a live version of Wes with Wynton Kelly playing Impressions. It's pretty smoking. So Wes could absolutely handle it. But I think he just felt he wanted to play something a little different stylistically. So that's why he didn't go out with Train.
Okay, well, speaking of stylistically, John, you know how, I guess, any alto player who's before Charlie Parker would sound pretty old school to us at this point. They'd be kind of swing era kind of folks, Johnny Hodges or somebody before that. And pretty much almost everybody since Bird, anybody you can think of from Sonny Stitt through, Tim Byrne, you're going to hear some Bird in there somewhere. And so to me, Bird was like Jesus Christ in this sense. There's before Jesus and there's after Jesus. It's the same thing with Charlie Parker. I'm not trying to sound sacrilegious, but everything changed. And would you say that it's that way with Wes Montgomery, pre-Wes and post-Wes, or is it more that everything changed much earlier with Charlie Christian?
That's a good question, because Wes learned initially by copying Charlie Christian records. I would argue that what Wes did was so unique, and there's some people who can approximate Wes's style quite well, but he was so unique and had a style that was so well developed that I'm not sure that you can really copy him and do him justice. So you can certainly take elements of his playing, like his block chord melodies, his octaves, his use of the thumb. So Benson and many others played beautifully, but Wes was really in a category of his own, I think. So you can borrow little bits and pieces from him, but I think he was so original, and to do what he did as well as he did is so difficult that I'm not sure that he would be necessarily as much of an influence as some other folks that were a little easier to copy, quite honestly.
Oh, in other words, kind of like Art Tatum would knock out any pianist. Yes. Good luck trying to play like the guy.
Yes, that's right. I mean, same thing as Wes. Although I think that's
I was at
right.
our friend JB's at John Butler's in Portland a few months ago, and he put on some vinyl of Wes playing at like just a screaming tempo, and it was unbelievably good. You know,
And he can do
way
that
up.
with his thumb. That's what's mind-boggling because most people can't do. I mean, that version of Impressions, similar, really bright. I mean, the tempo is it's up there. It's well over well over 250. And he's doing. And initially, his formula was single lines, octave, block chords. That was sort of his formula, not for all the solos, but most of them.
Right.
And what he could do with his thumb was pretty astounding. He did get a little callous there, so he could backpick as well a bit. It was not all downstrokes. But just to watch him do it and see how relaxed he was, there's a number of things up on YouTube, and he's just so relaxed, and the flow is so beautiful and interesting because his individual chords are not that complex, but he arranged them into these beautiful block chord melodies. So,
Well,
I tell
really,
people,
really quickly, if this is kind of more for the guitar nerd set or just guitarist period, but I mean that without disparagement. But as far as using your thumb, everybody knows Wes Montgomery played with his thumb, and then the last at least 20 years of his life, we both know from playing with him, John Abercrombie did the same. And
Yes, he did.
John would always tell us, he said, the only other major guitar player today who's playing jazz who uses his thumb that I'm aware of, that's how John put it, is Jimmy Ponder. And
yeah, Jimmy did it great too.
so are Wes and John and Jimmy the only major jazz guitarists who played exclusively with their thumb for playing single note lines?
Well, there are a number of guys who use sort of a hybrid right-hand technique using thumb and index finger. Kevin Eubanks does not use a pick, so it's thumb and index finger. So that's a different, although I'm sure Kevin can play Wes type things too, although Kevin is a very different player stylistically from Wes.
Okay.
But there are a number of folks who use a common. I met a fellow in Japan who's quite good, who used the same technique of, so you can essentially approximate pick in both directions by alternating thumb and index finger. So this fellow did the same thing, and he studied at Berkeley. He was quite good.
Okay, and
So
John,
that-
of course,
and that-
you have a very original style, but what do you always play with a pick?
Yeah, in my case, it's a small Fender teardrop pick, which is almost invisible because it's being covered up pretty much by my thumb and my first finger. It's always there. So it's 3 fingers and pick. And it's what I try to do. And maybe people think it's finger style because hopefully you don't hear the difference between the attack of the pick and the attack of the fingers. But those 3 fingers are being used pretty often. But all the lines are either pick, which is held between my index finger and thumb, and middle finger. So all the single notes are played with this or this. Everyone's
Gotcha.
right hand is different. Everyone's right hand is different in the guitar world.
And of course, this could be like a totally separate 3-hour interview about how various great guitar players play. But John, let's roll back the tape a little bit. So how do you get from being an aspiring guitarist in suburban Connecticut, but with New York City within your access, certainly on the train
Yeah.
or by car?
Yes.
How do you get from there to moving to New York City and meeting David Friesen?
Okay, so I tell every young musician, you probably do too, in your teaching, if an opportunity presents itself, or if you want to essentially be proactive to create as many opportunities as possible, at some point, some nice little door will open and you'll go through it and find yourself moving down a path you didn't plan or anticipate. So I knew I had to leave Connecticut because there was a pretty small gene pool, and I knew that New York was right there. I certainly had no illusions about being good enough to start playing the Village Vanguard. I just wanted to meet more folks and just find some places to sit in and do whatever I needed to do to make a living, probably doing something outside music. So I'd met a drummer named Bob Leonard, who was actually on Link Chamberlain's first record. He still lives in Connecticut, although he grew up in Westchester. So rather than being an hour from New York in Connecticut, I thought if I can be 20 miles away from New York, then I could get down a little more often to at least try to
Is
sit
this
in
when
and
you
meet
moved
folks.
to Dobbs Ferry, John?
Yes. So I was in Hastings and Dobbs Ferry, which are 2 little towns, as you know quite well, up the Hudson, just north of Yonkers. So I was within, shouting distance in New York. You could be downtown in your car in half an hour as opposed
Yeah,
to an
those
hour.
two towns roughly
in Connecticut.
22 miles from New York City, something like that.
Yeah. You jump on the Sawmill Parkway for those folks who are listening on the East Coast, and you're down in the city in half an hour with no traffic or less.
Well, I
So
don't
I
want to.
thought, let me just
Oh, I'm sorry. In Dobbs Ferry, just before I forget, I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to insert. Did you not say that you played with Chet Baker there, or that you met him there?
No, I didn't meet Chet Baker. Theo Saunders was there. Who else lived nearby? I remember hearing Blood, Sweat, and Tears rehearsing because they rehearsed in Dobbs Ferry. I never met Chet. I'm not sure how that story.
I'm sorry. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else. And was Gary Peacock living in Dobbs when you were there?
He was not, although I think he lived nearby, but not, a number of well-known jazz musicians now live nearby there, but there were not so many there when I was there. Probably a few.
So you're basically living in a beautiful, inexpensive suburb. You're looking at the
that's
Hudson River, and basically, if you didn't have a car, you get on the train, and you're there for 45 minutes, and you're in the city.
Yeah, or I'd usually drive in. So anyhow, I'm now in Hastings first. That's where I started. I got a little job driving a taxi. and was playing some little sessions. And one night I walked into this club, which is right next to the Bitter End, which is still there on Bleecker Street in the Village. And they had piano duos in there, probably 4 or 5 nights a week from something like 9 to 2 or 3 in the morning, long, long gigs. And people like Joanne Brackeen and Clint Houston and Mike Richmond playing bass. And my friend was Nina Sheldon, the Surf Maid. That's right. So I started going down there probably 3 or 4 nights a week just to plug into the bass player's amp and sit in for free. And so I started to meet some folks because it was a late gig, no cover. And they had a little film can and brushes under the piano. So the Village Gate was across the street. Very often a wonderful drummer would come over on his break and grab that film can, play some killing brushes. So I started to meet some folks. And one night in January of 76, David Friesen walks in, who's a bassist who still lives in Portland, Oregon. And we sat in together and became friends. And I said to him what I still say to anybody that I like when I meet them, let's play again. And he said, well, I just came. He'd driven across the country. I think he still has this work ethic with no gigs, but he'd already had some exposure playing on the road with Joe Henderson and Billy Harper and just wanted to come to New York. He knew a few people, and he thought by going, just showing up, he could make some connections and maybe find a bit of work there. So he was staying.
So you guys were in the same boat, really. You were trying to break into New York, and you met each other at the Surf Maid while you were kind of having the same individual mission, which was just to meet some folks, break in, open a few doors.
That's right. Yeah, although at that point, David had already played, as I mentioned, with Joe Henderson and Billy Harper on the road. So he had more experience than I did. He's about 8 years older than I am. So he was farther along. But he had not really freelanced around New York. He may have already played New York with Joe or Billy, but he didn't know a lot of people there. So his plan was just to show up. And I think he stayed with Lou Marini that time. Okay. So he said, I think I'll come back another. So we played maybe a session or two after our first meeting in January of 76. And I said, if you're coming back, please let me know. And at that point, my little apartment, I had moved from Hastings to Dobbs Ferry in a little kind of a converted apartment that was part of a house, really cheap. And my roommate had moved out, but the rent was $125 a month. So I didn't need another roommate. Right. At that point, I was also teaching at a little private conservatory in Westchester that had incorporated some jazz. So I was then making a really modest living teaching. I wasn't driving the cab anymore. So I said to David, if you're coming back, you can be in the city in half an hour. You're welcome to stay with me. So he came back again in the spring. I started learning some of his tunes. He found us a few little local gigs around Westchester. And then he said, I think I'll come back again. So this is 3 round trips in 1 year. You've done it. You know how long that drive is. Yeah. So I said, hey, if you're coming back, sure, stay here again. So at that point, I was learning his material. We were becoming better friends personally and musically.
Well,
so
let me put a pin in it. Let's hear you and David together, and then we can talk about the story more. Is that okay?
Of course it is. Yeah, the record you're going to play, Other Mansions, is from 79.
Yeah, so we're going to play a song called Other Mansions. So John Stowell on guitar, David Friesen on acoustic bass, and the duo became known as Friesen Stowell, right? Friesen Stowell duo.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so here's David and John playing Other Mansions, and then we'll go from there. Well, and we're back. So, John, it sounds great. You and David both. So, my first question is, what are your initial reactions hearing that recording 40 years later?
I think I've heard it once since we recorded it because
Wow.
Inner City released those as CDs. I don't have the LP version of that. So there's no resemblance to what I'm playing now. And I had no memory actually of that particular tune until right this moment. And to me, it kind of sounds sort of folky and sort of almost a precursor to some new age music. It's not jazz harmony per se. And we're playing primarily David's tunes. And on that particular tune, I'm playing a 12 string with the top two strings instead of tuned in octaves the way they normally would be, or actually in unison. I'm tuning them in fourths, although I changed that tuning eventually. So that's an electric 12 string. And the percussion is also me. I added various other instruments as we kind of moved along our path with the duo. We played for about 7 years together. So, I was still playing jazz when I wasn't playing with David, and David certainly understands and can play jazz. He's very comfortable playing a standard.
Sure.
But we started out playing some of his tunes and some standards, and then gradually just became all his music. And I enjoyed doing it while we did it. But I think at some point I felt like I wanted to get back to playing more jazz. So we had an amicable parting of the ways about 1983. But for about 7 years, we traveled around quite a bit together, and he encouraged me to write some music and to add the other instruments.
Well, I'm sorry, John. I believe you told me over the years that you and David, presumably without cocaine, drove from Portland to New York in 3 days with a mattress in the back of the van.
We did that more than once. We did, when we did some flying around because we did some international travel. We had one trip to Australia, one trip to Russia with Paul Horn and Paul's son Robin, a couple of trips to Europe, but primarily we drove. And we did, I'd say, more than once. It was not even a mattress. He had some Renault station wagons. He'd take his French bass and put it up on the side. I have my guitar and my amp. And gradually we added a little more gear. But one would sleep and one would drive. And we did that at least 2 or 3 times nonstop, where we'd leave Portland.
And you said whatever it was,
3 days later,
36 or 40 hours or something like that.
Yeah, well, you've made that drive many times. It's probably, I would say it's probably 50 or 60 hours of driving. Well, because you can't do it by yourself in 3 days, but with 2 people, you can do it. But as young as we were pretty tired by the time we got to the other end. But I became a pretty serious, pretty seasoned traveler, thanks to David, and getting a sense of, as you know, what the road is like, how to function well when you're tired, how to get where you're going, how to keep track of all the details so that you're functioning well.
When you were doing this duo and touring with David and you guys were busy, were you living in New York or had you moved to Portland already?
No, at that point, I mean, when I met him, my initial plan, he invited me out on that third visit. He came back to New York and said, why don't you come out to Oregon for 2 or 3 weeks and you can stay with me and my family and I'll find us a few gigs. I said, great. I'd never been to Oregon. No plans to live out here. And so as soon as I got out here to Portland, he found us some work and I ended up staying all summer, actually. We were quite busy, like 4 or 5 nights a week. I'd never played music.
As we know,
4 or 5 nights a week.
That David Friesen could find a gig on the moon. He's pretty good at that.
He is very good at it, or creating his own gigs. So I stayed all summer, and then he was going back to New York. There's a small label called Inner City that was kind of a spinoff from the original Music Minus One, which were the play-along LPs before Jamie Aebersold.
But there were a lot of great CDs on Inner City. Gregory Herbert, with Harry Danko.
Absolutely.
Later, your solo CD, Golden Delicious, correct?
Yeah. So the owner of this Music Minus One company was a man named Herb Cracker, who was a jazz fan. And he started initially licensing Steeplechase and some European labels. Then he thought he would start his own jazz label. And David at that point had been working with Ted Kurson for a minute. And Irv liked David's contribution on Ted's record. So he offered David a record. So at that point, I know all the material. So I came back to the East Coast. I had kept my place in Dobbs Ferry. And went back with him to record the record. That first record is called Star Dance, and that's with.
And you really didn't need to rehearse. You played what you guys had been playing, right?
Yeah, for probably 6-7 months. And Paul and Steve played the music beautifully. So at that point, it felt like the musical relationship would go on for a while. So I just subletted my place in Dobbs Ferry and came out to Oregon, not having any idea how long I'd stay.
Yeah.
And I'm still here. Although, until the virus, I've been mostly on the road lately, kind of like what you do, traveling around. But so you've been I like being based out here.
It's about 35, 38 years, something like that.
It was 76. So it's really 45 years of living on the West Coast.
Unbelievable. And, and I always think of you as a Portland musician, but that's because that's where we met when I first started coming out to Portland in 1994. And I already knew about you because Alan Jones had played me your record when we were students in Canada together. So
the band probably.
That's right. And he had it was on cassette. So we're not as old as you are, but we're pretty up there. So
we're all seasoned at this point.
But I do remember though, when Alan played me Golden Delicious, he said something like, check this guitar player out, check him out. And I just remember thinking that I enjoyed your playing more than a lot of other guitar players. I just thought it was kind of, I don't know, more in the pocket and ballsier and more modern. And I found it really relatable. And then when I started coming to Portland in '94 and you and I started playing duo together, which we're still doing when we can.
We are.
Right.
We'll do it again in February.
That's right. But hearing that, hearing that cassette of your solo record on Inner City, Golden Delicious, is what turned me on to you in the first place. So
Great. That happened. That was the connection through David, essentially, because Irv Cracker then offered me a record out of the blue. I was pretty young, 27, it's 26, 27.
Right.
And he said, I had gone back to New York the second summer, this was 77, to do another record of David's.
Right.
So I still had my place. We had a place to stay. So I just bumped into Irv on the street outside the bottom line, actually. And he said, oh, hi, John. Oh, hi, Irv. How are you? Looking forward to recording for you again with David. Would you like to do a record? I'm sure, I'd love to do a record for you. Just completely out of the blue, just standing in that line. Because he was looking for people to add to his catalog. So I had been around New York long enough. So I approached Jim McNeely and Mike Richmond, both of whom I knew. Mike knew Billy Hart. So Billy said, great. And I was going to initially get another trumpet player who couldn't make it. I got Claudio Roditi, who got Dalmum Ramau. They knew each other from Brazil.
Wow.
And David's on one tune. We had 2 rehearsals, and Billy at that point and they were all more seasoned than I was. I mean, Billy at that point had already played with Herbie and Getz and McCoy and everybody else. Billy couldn't have been nicer.
Well, actually, all 3 of them, Jim and Mike and Billy, had all worked with Getz or were going to.
That's right. That's right. But they were all totally fine. And, at a couple of rehearsals, we went in. It's not a bad first record. And Jim wrote some very interesting music, I thought.
So you can still tolerate listening to some of that record today?
Yeah, I don't like the sound I'm getting on the record, particularly the amp that I wanted to use was not available. So we just used what was in the studio. So the sound doesn't thrill me. Some of my solos it's not a bad first record.
All right. Well, beautiful. Well, how do we get from, I guess you said, did you play with David through about 77 or was it later?
No, we went longer. Like I met him in 76 and we went on through about 83. At various times we added some other people to our duo. So Gary,
I'm going to stop you. Perfect. 1983. Okay. You and David go to Russia with the great alto saxophonist, flute player, clarinetist. He was a great Hollywood studio musician, but really an excellent jazz flute player and an alto player, Paul Horn.
Yes, he was.
So tell us about going to Russia with Paul and David and how that came to be and how you came to go back about 4 other times afterwards.
Okay. Well, again, if you're not famous, it's just you happen to know someone who make the connection. In David's case, he did this a number of times where he would just call someone out of the blue and introduce himself to them and say, I'd love to play with you sometime. So that's what he did with Paul. Paul didn't know him. So they initially played a couple of duos. And then Paul, at that point, had been living on Vancouver Island for a while. He had landed immigrant status. And he met a promoter in Toronto who was bringing some Russian artists into Canada.
Okay.
So the Russian concert agency is called Ghost Concert. So they were bringing people like Kirov Ballet. So Paul had this connection with a man in Toronto who knew some of the books.
So was Canada in a diplomatic place with Russia that was much better than the United States with Russia? It's much easier
absolutely.
to go there from Canada.
Yes, although they knew clearly that we all had American passports. So somehow Paul found a way around that because in '83, obviously the relationships between the 2 governments was not great at all. But he was able to finesse it.
Were you guys the first, you were either the first American jazz group or partially American to play in Russia for a long time or ever, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I found this out when we got there. So we were there for about 3 weeks, and Paul's son, Robin Horn, who was then only 22 or 3, joined us. So it was a quartet. And we were playing a mixture of some standards, some ethnic things. Paul was playing flute, soprano, and some ethnic flutes. Mm-hmm. And so we were 6 nights in Moscow, 6 nights in St. Petersburg, which was then called Leningrad, and now it's back to Petersburg, and 2 cities in Lithuania. And American jazz groups had been going over to play since the 20s. But since probably World War II, there were very few, if any, public performances by Western jazz groups. And we were told we were the first public performance in Petersburg since Sidney Bechet in 27.
Wow. Hadn't Charles Lloyd actually recorded in Russia at one point?
He did. No, he was at the Riga Jazz Festival, and I think he may have done something in Russia as well. But the people, as a result, were very curious to hear us. We played 6 nights in Moscow, sold out a 2,000-seat theater.
Wow.
And in Moscow, people could not come back to hear us because the backstage area was controlled. But in Petersburg, we were playing in a big sports arena. And so when we came off stage, people came up to us and said, oh, that was great. And we ended up actually going back to some folks' apartments and hanging out with them. And I'm not sure if we were tailed or if there was any danger to them as a result.
Excuse me. So there was a real appreciation and hunger for real jazz from Russian.
There was. And actually, I don't know if you probably know the name Igor Butman, the tenor saxophonist.
No, Igor, the tenor player. Yeah.
So he's probably the most well-known jazz musician in Russia at the moment, has been for some time. But I met him on that first trip in '83 when he was 21 or 2 playing his butt off. And he came to, I think he studied at either Berkeley or NEC. He was in Boston, then in New York, and thought he would probably do better moving back to Russia, which turned out to be very true. He's got his own clubs and festivals. And
well I have it here. Excuse me, John. So basically, that first major tour that you did with Paul Horn and David was '83.
Mm-hmm.
You went back in '93, '95, '98, and 2012. Does that sound right?
Correct. Yeah, I met at the Lionel Hampton Festival that I started doing probably in the early '90s.
And that's
we were bringing some,
in Idaho, right?
That's in Moscow, Idaho, not Moscow, Russia.
Right.
Just by coincidence. So they had a connection with some international musicians and we're bringing some Russians over. So I was at the festival and I met a duo that was a Russian pianist and a Lithuanian saxophonist, really nice guys. And I said, hey, I had a great time in your country about 6-7 years ago. I'd love to go back sometime. So we just played a bit informally at that festival. And they were able to bring me back. I was able to go with them 3 times in '93, '95, and '98.
Beautiful. So basically the door was opened by going with Paul Horn, but you didn't go back with Paul Horn.
No, I did not go back with Paul. Paul went back one other time, but I went then with these 3 Russians. And then the last time in 2012 was Siberia in February, which I would not recommend if you're used to the cold with maybe you know this singer who's originally from, she's originally English, but she lives in New York, Tessa Suter. And I met Tess and did a few gigs with her.
Well, yeah, she
put
engaged to Billy Drummond, great drummer.
Correct. She and Billy are a couple. That's right. So Tessa and I did a few gigs together in the Northwest. And then we did this one tour in Russia in 2012. That was the last time I was there. So about 8 years ago.
Okay, slow your roll, John, just for a second, if you don't mind. Tell us, in these periods, in the 80s and 90s, were there any, I don't know, real difficulties in going to Russia? Because obviously you were able to go and get out of there safely and go back?
Well, yeah, no, things changed drastically after '89 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then going to Russia, the first time we went, people were standing in line for very little in the way of goods in the stores. And, people were living in pretty difficult times. And then when I went back in '93, things had changed substantially for the better in terms of availability of goods and the ability to travel freely and so forth. Although I can definitely tell you that even in '83, the individual Russians that we talked to were very warm, very friendly, very hospitable. So thankfully, governments and the status quo governments have nothing to do with cultural exchange or we were in people's apartments and they were feeding us. And actually, I still have on my wall 2 watercolors that our St. Petersburg artist made for us. And he said, I'm going to make these special frames for you as well. And he couldn't get them all done. He wanted to make 2 for each one of us in the band. So he took an 11-hour train ride with his wife and daughter to deliver these watercolors. And I still have them hanging on my wall.
So your experience over the last 31 years or something is that Russians are beautiful people and you've been really welcome.
Oh, yeah. Well, you've traveled internationally. And I think my experience, almost without exception, is if you go with an open mind, respect and curiosity for culture, and you're polite and do your job well, 99% of the people are gracious and helpful and happy you're there.
Right.
Any country.
Although some places you're astonished at how much better the reception is than in America. Like when you go to Japan and they know every record you've ever played on and know everything about you, you're going, why did you bother learning this? But it's so impressive how deep into the music they are.
Yeah, I would say all over the world, jazz is well regarded. It really is.
Okay, so answer this question for me. You have been to Argentina a great number of times. I remember we were together probably in Portland when you told me you were going for the first time. I thought it was very exciting and unusual because, of course, jazz musicians before this horrible pandemic, we did travel all over the world, but the most common thing for American jazz musicians was either to go to Europe or to go to Japan, and I'm sure Canada also. And so I thought it was a little off the beaten path for you to be working in Argentina. And you kind of schooled me. You said, well, when I go down there, I don't just play Buenos Aires, I play about 7 cities. And I remember, not to say anything negative, just after you had been there about 7 times, I said, wow, man, you're going to Argentina every year. And you might have said something casually like, yeah, now it feels like going to New Jersey in terms of familiarity.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
So, but again, in my case, if you're not famous, I'm not setting up large tours with bands. It's me. I mean, you've had the same experience. You meet one person who lives someplace else and you decide to go there.
Right.
So that one person could be in Oregon or New York or Argentina. So, and my,
In
my
a sense,
Argentine connection was also one guy.
well,
Singing.
just briefly, John, what's your experience been with Argentina, with the other jazz musicians and with the audiences?
Okay, so this started with a man named Pino Marone, who was living in LA, and he moved back to Argentina. He's from there and had some real success in the 70s with some fusion bands. So he was pretty active teaching and playing in Buenos Aires. So he brought me down the first 2 times. That was maybe when I mentioned to you that I was going. And then through him, I met other connections. Initially, we only played, I think, 1 or 2 cities.
Okay.
But then meeting other musicians who lived in other cities, I've now been probably in a dozen cities.
Now,
And
excuse
one friend
me, it's a
actually,
really long flight, but isn't it only like a 1 hour time difference because you're going south instead of east-west?
yeah, it's actually yeah, that's right. Is it a 3 or maybe it is? I think it's a 3 hour time difference. So it's substantially less in terms of jet lag because you're going primarily south. It's about a
Right.
10-hour flight from Houston to Buenos Aires. And when you get there, I haven't really had much problems with jet lag going down there.
Okay.
But I found that there are schools, clubs, festivals all over the world, including there, and some very good musicians,
Right.
even in some of the smaller cities.
Now,
So,
John,
like I said,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say I haven't been in. I'd love to go to the very south because I've heard Patagonia is incredible. I've got a friend in Ushuaia now, right at the very tip of Argentina, the very bottom. So maybe if I ever go back, it's unlikely anytime real soon because the economy down there doesn't really allow it to happen. But if I go back, I'll try to get all the way down to the very bottom. But most of my things have been in kind of central and northern Argentina.
Well, again, John, just from our friendship over the years, I know some other places that you've been that are a little more unusual to go to play jazz. I know that you've played in Croatia. You and I have both played in Hawaii. And what I didn't know until I went on your site to prepare for this interview is that you actually taught jazz at a school in Indonesia.
Yeah, that's a lady who was the director of a school that I taught to in Germany. I was there for about 6 months in 94, 95.
Germany led to Indonesia. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, basically one thing leads to another. So this lady went back to Indonesia. She was in Germany probably for 10 years, very good singer, and started a school there. Wow. So about 15 years ago, she brought me there. That's the only time I've been in Jakarta. And I've worked a bit in other spots in Asia, but I haven't worked a lot in Asia. But again, in my case, it's one connection, and then I go, basically.
Well, John, speaking of singers, so of course, you travel all over the world, but you have a lot of deep, long-lasting friendships, not only all over the world, but generally in your homes in Portland, Oregon, and in the New York City area. And of course, one of our mutual friends in Portland is, I believe, one of the greatest jazz singers alive, along with Sheila Jordan and Cassandra Wilson and a few other people. That would be Nancy King. And I guess Nancy just turned 80, and I think she's a little frail, but she's hanging in there. And what a tremendous musician. Let's hear you with Nancy King so we can turn people who have never heard Nancy King freak out when they hear her because they just say, how could someone be this good and I haven't heard them? And of course, Nancy, she just has whatever her thing is that's kind of kept her close to Portland and not really traveling a lot internationally. And anyway,
we can talk a little about Nancy afterwards because there's some interesting stories to tell about her.
Absolutely, yeah, and the Queen of Squat. Well, anyway, so here's Nancy King singing with John Stowell on guitar, and this is the old Matt Dennis ballad, beautiful standard that we like to play called "Everything Happens to Me." Let's hear a little about this, and then talk about Nancy and talk about working with some other singers.
Sure.
I make a date for go, and you can bet your life it rains. I tried to give a party, but the man upstairs complains. So I guess I'll go through life just catching colds and missing trains, 'cause everything happens to me. I never miss a thing. I've had the measles, the mumps, and every time I play an ace, my partner always trumps. I guess I'm just the girl that love would do the trick to end despair. But now I just can't fool this head that thinks for me. I've mortgaged all my castles in the air. So I telegraphed, I phoned, I sent airmail specials to you, but your answer was goodbye. There was even postage due. I fell in love just once. Why did it have to be with you? Why does everything happen to me?
Yeah,
Pretty
it's always
great.
always a drag to cut off Nancy King. But so John, actually that's a quartet record, I guess, with a couple of Italian folks on bass and drums. But
Correct. That was a live recording, and the bass player set up a little tour. I was over there with Nancy for probably 10 days, 2 weeks, and the recording was live from a couple of clubs.
but actually, you and Nancy have done quite a number of duo gigs over the years, just without a rhythm section, right?
We have, yeah, and she's, as you know, because you've done it with her too, she's a perfect partner because she can sing in any key and has perfect time. So it's really like your singing was, even though she can't find C on the piano, she has such incredible ears and reacts so beautifully to anything. You hear those lines, all the things she's referencing harmonically. She doesn't have a clue what any of it is theoretically. It's all just that incredible gifted ear.
It doesn't matter because, like I always used to say, Nancy doesn't know where middle C is on the piano, but she can solo on giant steps or stablemate. So her ears
Yeah,
are
that's
really
right.
elephantine. I mean, world class Mozartian ears. So, and of
That's
course,
right.
that makes really the comparison of almost any other singer. It's kind of an unfortunate thing because who can do what Nancy King does? But you've worked with a
Yeah.
lot of excellent singers, and some of them you work with on a regular basis, like Kendra Shank in New York and San
Yeah,
Francisco.
Kendra, actually, Nancy has mentored many good younger singers, including Kendra. So Kendra came up singing folk music. So she has this kind of crystalline, pure soprano voice, not the usual jazz voice, but she got drawn to jazz probably around the time I met her, about 1990 or 91, and studied a bit with Jay Clayton in Seattle and also with Nancy. And then she made the move to New York almost 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And you sat in with us one time there up at the Falcon. So you have a sense of what she does now.
Oh, and Jay Clayton is
Mark
going to
was
be on the show in January also, John.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, Kendra has surrounded herself since her time in New York with people like Frank Kimbrough and Ben Monder and Billy Drew. So she's really pushed herself to grow and develop.
And
And
Dean
has
Johnson. She's always got great bands. I noticed that.
always. Yeah. She surrounds herself with the best musicians she can find. Dean Johnson, Johnny Bear, many great musicians.
Sure.
So she has developed a vocabulary and a way to really improvise kind of in her own way, not the traditional scatting that Nancy does so well, but Kendra has found her own vocabulary and her own voice.
And, excuse me, when I sat with you guys up in Newburgh, New York, Kendra had some loops that she uses when you guys perform in a duo.
That's right. Yeah, she had bought that looping station originally as a practice tool, but I said, hey, when we did our recording, we did it in the city with a friend that started out just as a demo project, and we liked it enough to turn it into a record. I said,
Sure.
Just bring your loop station and let's see what happens. We have no idea what it'll work. but she found some really interesting creative ways to use it. So that is now definitely a part of any time we do a gig together. She'll bring the looper, and she uses it in some very creative ways, I think.
Okay, well, John, a more general question. Speaking for maybe guitarists and pianists and vibes players, chordal instruments, succinctly, what are the things you need to do well to accompany jazz singers well?
Well, it depends on the singer. With someone like Nancy, you can do almost anything and she will hear it and react to it intuitively. But my goal, and when I was listening to that back now, I think my accompaniment has evolved a bit since that. Like that record's 20 years old now. We did that in 99.
Okay.
And to me, when I'm listening to it now, it sounds a little busy and some tensions and maybe what the appropriate choices to use there. So part of it is just knowing essentially what a particular singer needs to feel comfortable. Every singer is different.
Mhm.
But I think if you're going to use tensions, certainly intelligent voice leading on top. So just listen to how a great pianist accompanies the vocalist or a guitar player who thinks pianistically. So
And
certainly
what,
some
what
intelligent
is the
voice
difference?
leading.
I mean, obviously, a pianist has 2 hands, 10 fingers. They can play
Yeah.
much wider voicings and thicker voicings. And, you know, I guess with a guitar, unless you're Joe Cohn using your forefinger, you're limited to
Yeah.
kind of four voices most of the time, right?
True. Although, I mean, that's sort of a liability and an asset. A liability in the sense that a singer who's used to piano will not feel as supported by guitar initially.
Mhm.
But I think our asset is the fact we bring this beautiful intimacy to the conversation that as you become comfortable, especially in the duo setting, in terms of voice leading, maybe walking bass, some inner voice movement, we can do some things that are pianistic in nature, although we don't have 10 voices available to us.
Now, not like when you were making your own quartet CD, where obviously Jim McNeely would have played a certain role to, he would have been soloing and accompanying, but he would have been supporting you. When you are in a band that's larger than a quartet, either a quintet or larger, or a band with a singer where there is a pianist and yourself, what is your aesthetic about one of you laying out versus the other one not doing it? Or do you like playing together and making it work? What do you think?
Well, you and I played with Gary Versace, so you heard me in that setting. In
But
which,
playing
and
with
Gary's
Gary
a great
Versace is
piano
like
player.
playing with Nancy King. He can do anything in the
Pretty
world.
much.
That's an exceptional situation. You know?
True, but I would argue that when in doubt, leave more space than less. So sometimes it's appropriate just to not play. I mean, very
Well, so
often
what?
pianists will
So
accompany
isn't there a
themselves.
general etiquette among more mature pianists and guitar players if they find themselves on the same gig? Maybe there's a trumpet solo, and you just kind of lay out and let the piano player accompany during the whole trumpet solo. Then maybe there's a tenor solo, and maybe you would take over and the pianist would lay out, which I think is very musical, but it isn't always necessary if you've got 2 fine players who know how to work with each other, rather than just saying no, sir, after you, no, after you.
Yeah.
So what
You
is
and
the
I also, you and I,
Well,
you
I'm
and I
sorry.
also play with Roger. You and I also play with Roger Wilder. So you've heard me in that setting a few times with piano and guitar.
That's right. But I know what you sound like, and obviously you make it very musical. And a pianist as great as Gary Versace or Roger Wilder, it will be musical. My question for the listeners out there, and particularly for guitarists and pianists and younger players, is what is your attitude about guitar and piano comping and playing at the same time? What do you do? How do you stay out of the way? How do you complement them? What if they play a flat 9 and you play a natural 9? How do you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, lots of space. In some cases, playing nothing, maybe even playing half notes or whole notes, just single notes, as opposed to full chords. Typically, you don't want to play all 6 strings for that very reason, because if it's a dominant chord, there's a chance you're not going to agree, and that's going to trip up the soloist with all this harmony underneath the solo that's too dense and not working together. So more space. You know, occasionally one small variation that will happen. I've done this with a few piano players, and you hear this on the Jim Hall, Bill Evans Undercurrent record on Funny Valentine. Occasionally, if you're playing with piano, a piano player will put his or her left hand away, which is an invitation for you to comp for them. So it's an unusual sound to hear the piano soloing with their right hand and guitar accompaniment, and it can work. And I've done that with Randy Porter in Portland,
Sure.
Goebel, and others. So that's not the usual, but if a piano player does that, they're essentially inviting you to take a more active role as accompanist.
Excellent. Okay. Well, John, let's talk about some of the great horn players and other musicians that you've worked with. And I know that it may vary how much you did with each of these folks, but can I read out a name and have you give us like a 1-paragraph summation of what you did with them and how you enjoyed it, how you felt about it?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, let's start with some tremendous trumpet players. Art Farmer, who may have been playing just flugelhorn by the time you played with him.
He was. That was one gig in Portland. Oops, sorry, about 1983. And David Friesen arranged that gig. So he put the group together. And Art gets up on stage and says, I haven't been in Portland since 1951. It's great to be back.
Huh.
And there was actually no piano on that gig. And I think initially he was a little bit surprised by my playing. He said, when I first heard you, I was a little bit in shock just because I'm kind of different, you know. But he warmed up. He couldn't have been nicer. Everybody got lots of space. He had his charts beautifully written. We were just playing standards.
And excuse me,
And
so
he
who
sounded
was
like,
the bassist and who was the drummer?
I'm trying to remember. It could have been Ron Steen. It might have just been a quartet with the four of us. The people who don't know Portland musicians. Ron is a great, very
But those
seasoned
of
drummer.
you
Who's
who know the great Art Farmer, Jim Hall quartet, that would make a
absolutely.
lot of sense. There, I mean, actually,
Yeah.
I didn't know about that band, and Abercrombie turned me on to them. I guess one of them is called, I think, From Sweden with Love.
Yes,
And
they did Swedish
Abercrombie
songs. That's
told
right.
me that he was really influenced by that band of Art Farmer and Jim Hall together, and that he really loved it. So it couldn't have been a total shock to Art showing up to a gig and being given a great
No.
guitarist rather
No.
than a pianist.
No, I think Art was comfortable with guitar. And actually, you can actually see that group with Art and Steve Swallow. And I think it could have been, I'm not sure if it was Pete LaRocca for that particular clip, but you can see some of the jazz casuals that Ralph Gleason did in San Francisco with Jim, with both with Sonny Rollins in a quartet with guitar only, and also with Art Farmer. Those jazz casual shows are wonderful.
So, of course, and Art Farmer is just one of the swinging and most melodic and laid back of
Yes.
all jazz soloists, right?
Yeah. And Jim recorded with him later on as well. I think in some of Jim's groups, he had Art to come in, and Art had been living in Vienna for many years. He couldn't have been nicer. Very low key, very casual, very nice.
Beautiful. Okay, well, two other fantastic jazz trumpet soloists that you've worked with, and you can enlighten us to what you did with them. Known primarily as a West Coast LA guy, played a lot with Oliver Nelson and Stan Kenton, the tremendous Conti Candoli.
Conte was, yeah, he was wonderful. And also that was one gig. I was thinking at a festival in Utah. It might have been one of the ski resorts that had organized a jazz concert. So it was like an all-star group with Pete Chrisley, Conti, trying to think maybe a couple of Salt Lake City musicians, and David Friesen and I. And so we were just playing tunes. Conti couldn't have been nicer. Same thing. I mean, we have these very experienced guys. Yeah, he was just swinging and playing beautifully. You know, and very often some of these folks are kind of legendary. Very often they're just as relaxed and friendly as could be. And it was just, let's play some tunes. Let's have a good time. Everybody solos, no ego or star attitude, not at all. And they knew that clearly I was probably the least experienced by far of the folks in the band, but I was playing well enough that I could more or less hold my own with the guys.
It's certainly enjoyable. And he was playing at the top of his game, and Art in the same situation, right?
He absolutely was. He was sounding great. And his brother Pete was quite a respectable trumpet player too, as you know.
That's right. Although I think he was known a little more as a lead player, but Pete Candoli could certainly play jazz also, and was known for jumping up on Woody Herman's bandstand dressed as Superman. I don't know if you knew that as a Pete Candoli.
I did not know that.
He may have been the more type A personality of the two brothers.
They both came actually together to the Lionel Hampton Festival at least once, and they couldn't have been nicer. You know,
beautiful.
Very friendly, approachable. Yeah.
Let's get into that in a second. Tell us what you did with Tom Harrell.
That was a couple of gigs maybe in the mid 70s, right before I came out to Oregon. And then in 93, I had to put a trip together with some work with Lionel Hampton's big band, my Russian friends, and I started the trip in Paris. And the reason that happened is because I knew a man who was booking a small basement club in a hotel, and Tom was coming in as a single. And I hadn't played with him maybe in 15 years, but he remembered me. So it was the two of us and a very good French bass player for a week. And in fact, I still have a few of those tunes from that week. And Tom, you know, once he felt relaxed and comfortable, he was just fine. Of course, he's playing beautifully.
He really is a genius soloist on trumpet and flugelhorn, and I think one of the finest writers in jazz. You know, I mean, kind of get up there with Wayne Shorter and Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. I mean, every Tom Harrell tune is really incredibly beautiful and worthwhile.
Yeah, you and I played through a few of them together. Like, I think you brought Little Dancer one time to a session. I've got a few others that you and I'll go through together that I think you'd enjoy.
We actually recorded "Sail Away" on that Brazil project CD.
Right. Sail Away, that's right. Yeah, I do. And there's another nice waltz of his called "Scene" that I want to lay on you that I think you'd enjoy.
Yeah, I know that we have that chart, but it's a little cut off. I think at the bottom.
Yes, maybe so.
Well, okay,
we can rectify that.
Mind, Herschel, if you don't mind, we're going to go on to this next piece, Ambleside. And so, John, I guess what happened is I came to Portland in 1994 to work with Alan Jones and Dan Schulte and Peter Bowe and Steve Christofferson. And it was my first trip to Oregon, even though I was born in Eugene. And I was starting to see what a great scene there was in Portland at the time. and you used to come out to the farm out Highway 30, and we would play duo. And I remember thinking, well, I don't have a car, and I'm like 10 miles from town, and isn't it nice that this great guitar player, John Stowell, keeps on driving out here to play with me, out here in the grass and the wheat and whatever. And I guess that's how we started, but we have been recording and performing as a duo with a repertoire without the need for other players for quite a while. So when we do get to play with another bassist like Essiot or Mike Doolin or Glenn Moore, it's a bonus, but we have our thing anyway, right? And
I like both, actually. I like both. I mean, the duo is a particular conversation. Adding other folks, of course, is great too.
Sure. Well, here's an example of the John Stowell, Rob Scheps duo. We made 2 CDs together that are that exist, that you could maybe find somewhere. One is Brazil Project on the New Media label in Canada, and then the other one is Portland Sessions Volume 1. This song, I think, will be on Portland Sessions Volume 2 whenever we manage to get it out. And this is a duet that we did, I don't know, maybe 2009, 2010. But long story short, Rob Scheps on flute, John Stowell on 12-string, or not 12-string, excuse me, nylon string guitar.
Yes.
And this is a piece by not the dude from Duran Duran, John Taylor, but John Taylor, the tremendous British jazz pianist who was a particular favorite of his countryman Kenny Wheeler's. And so this is a piece called Ambleside. It's a waltz, and this is, I guess, myself, you and me, John, playing Ambleside. So let's check this out.
Not bad, Mr. Scheps.
Back at you, Mr. Stowell. Well, I probably haven't heard that in a few years, have you? Because we didn't get around
I
to
haven't.
it. So,
Hey, Matt, put in a quick plug for our friend who not only recorded us, but built that guitar, our good friend Mike Doolin, who is a great bassist, guitarist, luthier, and has a beautiful home studio in his house. And we played at the house as well. Mike is, and you and I have been doing some socially distanced jamming in different rooms at Mike's. So he built that kind of my nylon string guitar for me in '05, and I've played it happily ever since. And we've used that on a few of our recordings.
and that's the guitar that we're looking at when we see these still photos of you in some of the pieces we played today. And it's basically, as you always say, it fits in the overhead, and the guitar kind of disassembles, and the body is made of cloth rather than wood or something hard. Correct?
No, that's a different. Those travel guitars are also made in Oregon. This is the one that the full-bodied nylon with the double cutaway that looks like Mike's designs that you've seen.
Okay.
I've played that guitar in gigs with you as well. So those little travel guitars are made by my buddy Roscoe Wright, which are ideal for flying because they're so small.
Sure. Okay. So, question that came to us actually from Herschel, our producer. He wants to know
Okay.
that song that we just heard, Ambleside by John Taylor. He wants to know, are these giant steps changes or something close? Just curious.
You've got a good ear, Herschel. Not quite, but it does have it does have some minor third movements like giant steps, and it does move around in a variety of keys. So in both of those senses, harmonically, there are some similarities.
It's definitely, it's not a tune that is harmonically for the faint of heart. You really have to know some harmony to even be able to connect the dots to get through it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically lots of 5/1s or 2/5/1s and about 4 or 5 different keys. And that's actually the village that John Taylor lived in, Ambleside Days. That's where the title comes from.
Oh, okay. And I'm assuming that's outside of London somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's in the country. In fact, they now have a festival named in his honor there.
Oh, okay, beautiful. All right, let me just get a little light here because the Christmas lights are only providing so much light. So, some other people that you played with, John. Let's talk about what did you do with, for example, alto saxophonist Richie Cole and trombonist Bill Watrous?
Those were also just one-offs. I think I've met Richie a number of times over the years. We may have only done one gig. He came to Portland as a single. This is probably late 70s. And we did one gig together. Couldn't have been nicer. Just playing tunes. You know, he just said, just bring the real book and we'll call tunes. Very often, guys, leaders, some will have charts. Some are very organized about specific repertoire. Others are very low key about it and just say, let's just call some tunes.
Right. Okay. And
so
that
was that.
I'm sorry, your experience with Richie was the latter. Let's just call some tunes.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd say that's true with many of the well-known leaders. Although Art Farmer came with charts. A few others have brought charts. Bill Watrous, I met him a few times at the Lionel Hampton Festival, and I think we did that one gig that Conte Gondola was on. I think Bill Watrous might have been on that gig, and then I did a few workshops with him at the Lionel Hampton Festival in Idaho.
Okay.
Consummate trombonist.
So Billy Hart is on your resume. Is that primarily playing on your record, or did you work with Jabali live also?
That unfortunately was only that record. I actually saw him about a year ago when he came to Portland for the Portland Jazz Festival. So I've bumped into him probably 2 or 3 times since 1977. But the one time we played together was my record in 1977.
In the last 2 or 3 months, and he's still playing his living ass off.
Yeah, he sounded good a year ago when he was playing with the guys in Portland with George Colligan and John Lakey and Nicole Glover. So it was a nice gig.
That's right. He came to PSU. Tell us about playing with Billy Higgins.
That was a weekend gig at a small club owned by Pat Senatore, who had played some bass with Herb Alward, made some money, bought himself a nice club in Malibu on the beach. Okay. And David and I worked there a few times because David knew Pat. Pat is now semi-retired in Italy. And we did a weekend with Billy Higgins there. This is probably late 70s. Billy couldn't have been nicer. Big smile on his face, beautiful, light, airy, swinging time. Total pleasure.
Than anybody, right?
He played. His just was. You hear the joy. Certain people, you hear the joy in their playing. Clark Terry, you can hear his spirit. Billy Higgins, same thing. You can feel his spirit on the drums when he played.
Right. Well, I'd prefer one more name to that list would be Joey Barron is another guy who you can definitely feel that he's playing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you feel the joy.
Well, and there are a lot of emotions in jazz, but joy is occasionally one of them.
Yeah, but I think for the audience to see someone just in love with playing music is a nice experience for the audience. We can tend to be a little serious up there because we're sometimes playing difficult music. But if they see you smiling and reacting to each other, that I think makes the experience better for the audience. Sure. If it comes naturally.
John, what did you do with great vibroharpist, vibraphonist Milt Jackson? And what did you do with our friend George Cables, who is the next gentleman on this show?
He's coming.
Yeah.
Great. So right around the time that I played with Richie Cole, Bill Jackson also came to town as a single. So that was a group with David Friesen again. I think David had maybe been called initially. Yeah, this was, and Mel Brown on drums. So this is maybe 77, 78. And Milt said, I want to make sure I get your last name right. And let's just play some tunes. Same as Richie, very relaxed, very easy. Couldn't have been nicer. And
Right.
he didn't know us, And I think very often when you're a leader, if you're traveling as a single, you learn how to. I mean, maybe I took some of my cues from being a leader from some of these folks, which is that if you're coming into a town and someone might be a little nervous to play with you, although in my case, I don't have the stature that those folks did, obviously.
Like,
But
don't
if
give
I'm
them
coming into town,
here. Like, play some tunes.
yeah, yeah,
Relax.
or maybe I'll bring some charts, but I'll just say, here's something, if you're not, anything you're not comfortable with, we're not going to play. So
Gotcha.
my goal is to make everyone feel relaxed and happy and play their best. And the audience sees us finding some common ground, relating to each other. And I think it's great for them to see their good local musicians shining and playing well with someone who's coming in from out of town. So everybody feels good if the music is relaxed and comfortable and everyone's playing their best. So that's my goal.
Wonderful. Well, John, here's a guitar question. There's this old cliche. Some might call you a guitarist's guitarist, but there is some basis for that. I have that there's some quotes from tremendous guitar players who have really dug your playing, like Herb Ellis and Mundell Lowe and Larry Coryell. What about that?
Well, in that case, and I tell other musicians to do this too, if you have the occasion to meet somebody who's more well-known, who could potentially offer you a little bit of help, say to them, if you know them well enough to do so, hey, would you mind writing a sentence for me from my resume? Some will say yes, some will say no. So those folks did not volunteer those quotes. I asked them for them.
Oh, you asked all three of those fellas for
I
quotes.
did. In the case of Herb Ellis, actually, he had written that when we did the gig together. It's a little something for an interview. So I did not ask Herb, but almost every quote in my resume is something that I asked for without any expectations of getting a reply. And if you don't knock on the door, people are not going to answer. That's for sure. So my history, maybe yours too, is just knocking on doors all the time and seeing who answers.
Well, sometimes we get a call and it's easy, and other times we have to pursue something. Again,
Yes, that's right.
And hopefully post-pandemic. John, how do you relate stylistically and generationally and in terms of friendships with your contemporaries who are well-known jazz guitarists? Jim Hall, John Abercrombie, we talked about Schofield a little earlier. Pat Martino, who of these folks have you been close to or been friendly with or been influenced by or whatever?
I'd say thanks to you, probably I became most friendly with John Abercrombie, although I met him in the 70s. But thanks to you, we did probably, I'm guessing 7 or 8 at least sessions at John's house because he'd like to play when he wasn't touring. So I got to know him a little better and play with him thanks to you.
We would play quintet with you and John both in the band.
Yeah, and you always hooked up a good rhythm section. We always had a great time. I remember the last one, it ended up just being the 3 of us at the end because the other guys had to peel off. But it was great fun.
And I guess none of us wanted to stop playing at that point.
No, and we had a good time. And we always did. So I think stylistically, John and I are sort of different harmonically, but we had kind of a shared language. We both valued space and trying to play lyrically. So even though I don't sound like him, I think we had some sort of shared musical aesthetics.
And
Jim Hall also.
At least since the 90s, post Roland guitar synthesizer, post rocking out with Billy Cobham and with, Record Brothers and Dreams. I mean, I think of John and you as guitarists who most of the time play with a very clean, crystalline sound.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of us, Pat Metheny, John Schofield, Bill Frisell, although Bill still uses some pedals, but a lot of guys who went through Process Sounds pedals. I had a guitar synth for a while too, right before I met you. And a lot of us have gone back to a very pure basic sound, really, so you can just hear the sound of your hands on the instrument making a sound. So Schofield these days, right into a Fender amp. Pat Metheny, kind of a high-tech setup, but for the most part, unless he's playing his guitar synth, same thing, right into an amp with just a bit of reverb. So a lot of guys are returning to a more pure sound.
Well, here's something interesting. Abercrombie told me, I think he was in Woodstock, and somehow he and Pat Metheny were both there, and maybe Pat was even living near there at that time. But what happened, I guess, is Pat had the Roland guitar synthesizer, which was new, and I'm believing this was in the 80s. The red one.
Yeah.
And John told me that he basically said to Pat, that's incredible. What's that, man? And Pat said, I don't know if the red one was out yet, but the point being, Pat had a prototype, a new Roland guitar synthesizer. And when Abercrombie told him that he dug it, Pat said, don't buy this one. Wait for the next one. It's coming out in about 6 months. Get that one. And John said he took Pat's advice, and that's the one that he became known using, John that is, in his trio with Mark Johnson and Peter Erskine.
Yep.
Interestingly, while he was playing that guitar synth, John did tell me that that's the most successful he's ever been, that group was working all the time. They were getting good fees. They were really quite successful when he was using some electronics like that.
Yeah, I think the problem with the initial guitar synthesizers was that they didn't track well. You couldn't really articulate with the pick. There was too much lag and latency. And then as you're saying,
that when you're trying to play a duet on Zoom or on another online platform today, and there's a slight delay or a slight buffering, is that what you were experiencing with the first guitar synths?
Yeah, they didn't track well. You couldn't really articulate when you were soloing. There's too much lag time between the time you picked the note and the time it came out the speaker. So Pat was right in giving John that advice. So by the time John bought one, they were definitely tracking better. And they're tracking quite well now for the folks who still use them. Pat still uses one occasionally. That kind of fuzzy trumpet sound he likes.
What are your personal experiences interacting with Pat and Bill Frisell and even Jim Hall over the years?
Jim, that's an interesting story, actually, because when that first record of mine, Golden Delicious, came out, Jim has a cousin who lived at the time in Portland, a percussionist named Jessica Marcus. So I met her in the 70s.
Okay.
And we just became friends. And so when that record came out, I just told her how much I liked Jim. And she said, "Oh, Jim's my cousin." I said, "Wow, you think I could send him the record?" Because I mentioned him in the liner notes as being an influence. And she said, "Well, yeah." So she said, "I don't think he'd mind." Sure. So she gave me his address. I didn't expect to hear from him, but I sent him the record. About a year later, I was working at Beefsteak Charlie's in the Village. This is probably 78 or 79 with David Friesen. And Jim walks in, sits at the bar.
Okay.
I said, "Yeah, I got the record. Sounds good. Keep going. It's great." And then I had the chance to play one. I sat in with him one time at the New School when he was teaching there for one of his classes. And after they took a break, I played with them. And then when the students took a break, Jim and I were just sitting in the room. And I said, "Do you feel like playing a couple of duos?" And we did.
Beautiful. Well, so the thing that you're a very polite, generally soft-spoken gentleman, but you have a lot of balls when it comes to asking people to play, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all they're going to say is no, and that's really okay. I never press the point beyond.
You go into it with I can accept a no, and then sometimes you're really glad at 1 a.m. that you asked earlier in the evening.
Oh, yeah. I mean, sometimes it's a real shot in the dark. I mean, I have a good quote from Lalo Schifrin in my resume, and that happened because he came to Portland to do a concert for Chamber Music Northwest. And a friend of mine was the engineer for that concert. And he played something of Lynn Darrick's, who you know, who's been on the radio for many years, that I'm playing on. And my friend said, "Hey, Lalo, I liked your playing." So I said, "Boy, this is really a long shot, but I'm going to send him an email." I got his email from my friend who got it. And, "Dear Mr. Schifrin, you know, I'm the guitarist that happened to be on the thing that you like. Would you consider writing a sentence for me for the resume?" And he did. I never met him.
And Lalo Schifrin,
assistant.
Composed the incredible theme to Mission Impossible, but was also
many other things.
Well, he was in Dizzy Gillespie's quintet as the pianist.
He was.
Real high order, you know, with people like Kenny Barron and other pianists in that.
Oh, yeah.
Plus, he
is an
adept classical composer and writer for string orchestras. And so
dozens of film scores. He was a very versatile player. I think he's still around in his 80s. Well, I never met the man, but the fact that, I thought this is really a long shot in the dark, but the fact that he said something nice about my playing, never hurts to ask and say, "Would you consider it?" I honestly did not expect to hear a word, but he wrote quite a nice quote for me.
That's very nice. Well, John, speaking of two other people, Lionel Hampton, with whom you played for 3 weeks, and Elvin Jones, with whom you played for 3 tunes.
That's right. So those both happened at the Lionel Hampton Festival. I met the man who was booking it. This is in Idaho. It's now quite a bit. Moscow, Idaho. It's a college town, about 4 hours from Portland. So I had some friends on the faculty there, and I met the man who was booking the festival. And he had me in primarily to do workshops, but I would also occasionally play the evening concerts. And they started with a very small festival, and Lionel was invited one year because one of his sidemen had gone to that college and had a good time and offered to come back. And then he started inviting his friends to come. So the festival ballooned into this huge 4-day event with 20 or 30,000 different high school and college people coming to compete in combos, and then evening concerts and daily workshops. So they would typically bring in 15 to 20 international profile musicians, some from the States, some from Europe, some from Asia. So I got friendly with the man who was booking the festival. He'd been on faculty there, and then he left the faculty to manage booking the festival full-time. It became a full-time job. And they ultimately named the music school for Lionel Hampton. And he went every year for the rest of his life, starting in the late 1970s. So by the time I was coming there in the early 90s, it was a huge festival. The town doubled in size for 4 days.
Wow.
So one year, Elvin was the house drummer for this festival. I'm sure they paid him well. So they were putting together different combinations for him. And I was there with my two Russian friends who I then had gone to Russia with a few times, a German bassist. And the man who was organizing it, just kind of very impromptu backstage, said to Elvin, "Oh, would you mind playing a few songs with these guys?" And he said, "No problem." So we did. We did Yesterday's, My Ideal, and what else? I think we did three, and Will It Weep for Me. And it was funny on Yesterday's.
Funny, you really remember this stuff because I've been
Oh
friends
yeah,
with
absolutely.
since my early 20s. And I love Joe's playing and I love him as a person. He's always been very supportive and friendly, but I don't get to play with him that often. You know, he's Joe
Sure,
Levant.
but you have played with Joe. Yeah,
Well,
but your memory, you've got a memory like a steel trap.
well, it's a, you know, like George Burns said, it's a curse, you know, but
Mhm.
Joe, you know, lives outside of Newburgh, New York. And I was playing there with Marvin Boogaloo Smith, who's an incredible drummer who had worked with Archie
Yep.
Shepp and Ra. And I think, and Joe, the gig was happening kind of every Tuesday for a while.
I remember
And
that gig. You told me about it.
yeah, and Joe kept on kind of threatening, "I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. One of these Tuesdays, I'll be there. I'll be there." And finally, I get an email from Joe saying, "Okay, next Tuesday, I'm coming. I'm coming."
All right.
And I thought, well, man, I'm not going to bring a tenor saxophone to play with Joe Piano. I'm going to stand down and, you know, be cool and
The soprano.
not even try to hang. Well, you know, I play an awful lot of soprano, but so I said, well, I'm just going to leave the tenor at home. I brought the soprano. I go into the bar, and it's called the Terrace Tavern, just in the hood, regular neighborhood in Newburgh, New York. And I see
Mhm.
Joe at the bar. I say, "Hey, man, you came. Where's your axe?" And he points to the floor, you know, under his bar stool, and there's his soprano.
Funny.
So we both brought the soprano, but I can tell you right now, I know we played Up Against the Wall by Coltrane, and we played Aerogen.
Mhm.
And now I'm forgetting the third tune, but it's just three tunes. You know, so these
I'm
things.
sure. I'm sure it was fun. I played with Joe one time too. He's a sweet guy. He and Judy both are really a wonderful couple.
No doubt, they're wonderful, and I love when Joe says Judith.
They've been
But
together for something like 35 years.
I believe they're high school sweethearts.
Yeah.
So, but tell us about actually playing with Elvin Jones, because the polyrhythmic thing, as swinging and as incredible as it is, that doesn't mean it was easy.
It actually was kind of what I realized, and I knew this from hearing the records. When you do eights with Elvin, you're not counting. It's not metronomic. It's like you're trying to count the ocean or the wind in the forest. So it just becomes textural. There's no time, but he always gives you a downbeat to bring it back. So I wasn't lost at all. And you know, everything is way back at the beat, obviously, but I knew that from hearing the records, and I knew it was fine. It really were, you kind of push up against it a little bit, and it was great actually. And he couldn't have been. I don't think he knew our names. He just, sure, let's play, and it was easy and fun for him, I think. I mean, we gave him plenty of space, and just another quick moment in his musical life, and I'm sure he forgot about it as soon as he got off the bandstand. But it was fun. I didn't put it on the resume just because it was three tunes, but it was. Actually there's video of one of those tunes on YouTube, and it was fun.
Oh, of you playing with Elvin and the two Russian fellas.
Yeah. Yes, it was fun.
Let's talk after.
Yeah,
I want to see that. So, John,
sure.
there's so much more to talk about. I hope that one day you'll come back to Convo Improvvo, because I don't think we got through all of it.
Have me back anytime. If you do rotations and bring folks back, I'd love to do it again with you.
We haven't even gotten, we know we've had 42 people and we haven't even started cycling people back because a little commercial here. So, you know, of course, it's a really rough year, but happy holidays, safe holidays to everybody. This is being taped.
Absolutely.
At December 27th, 2020, worst year on recent record. But when we come back after New Year's next week, on January 3rd, we've got George Cables. On January 10th, we have Kirk Lightsey coming all the way from Paris. On the 17th, the great singer Jay Clayton, who we're friendly with, that we spoke about. On the 24th, tremendous trumpet player in New York, Alex Norris. On the 31st, before our winter break, Joe Bowie, the founder of Defunct, and one of the scariest trombonists who ever lived. And when we come back in March, we're looking at Tom Scott, Freddie Hendrix, Gary Smulyan, Dave Stryker, Frank Tate, and our producer doesn't even know this yet. On into April, Johnny King, and we just booked Larry Schneider.
Oh, wow. How did you find him?
Facebook.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, I've been looking.
Stella.
Well, Larry Schneider is one of my favorite tenor players. I don't mind outing myself about that. I've always been influenced by Larry. And, you know, sometimes with slightly older fellas, they're not on Facebook, but I ran into Larry on Facebook and I sent him a friend request and I just wrote to him and said, listen, your playing means a lot to me. You know, I heard you with Horace and Thad and Mel, and and Bill Evans. And I love your playing, and nice to connect with you. Just reached out to him earlier this afternoon and said, would you care to do an interview in this series? And he wrote back, yeah, sure. It's kind of casual.
Excellent.
But kind of like what you do. I mean, I don't know Larry well at all, but I was glad that I asked.
Absolutely. Well, and he responded. That's great. Is he still in the Bay Area?
Yeah, he sure is. Yeah, and we're working on a date for Dave Liebman. I don't want to forget before we go tonight that you made an interesting record with Dave Liebman and great Toronto pianist, bassist, multi-instrumentalist Don Thompson. And I think you did what was Liebman's project, which was a tribute to Sidney Bechet.
Yeah, we've done 3 in total now. So I've hired him for all 3 of them. The first one was done at Banff. We were all teaching up there, and Don told me about the studio. I didn't even know about it. Maybe you recorded there too when you were there.
I did. They have a great studio there.
Yeah. So Don and I started, and Dave wandered in and did no rehearsal, but that was the first one. That came out on Origin a couple of years later in 2002. And then just out of the blue, Dave sent me, do we have another minute or two, or are we kind of running out of time? Or
a couple minutes, sure.
Okay.
We're about
Dave just reached out to me when he'd seen a video. I hadn't been in touch with him for a while, although I've known him since the 70s through Link Chamberlain. And I thought maybe I'll just hire him and we'll go to Red Rock there when he was living out in Pennsylvania in Stroudsburg. So we both brought some tunes. So that was one called Blue Rose. That came out on Origin about 5 years ago.
I haven't heard that
one.
I
thought, yeah, it's good. So then I thought maybe I'll just see if I can hire him again, So then someone had sent him this book of Bechet transcriptions. And he said, let's do Sidney Bechet tunes. And I said,
which is unusual. Although, I mean, Dave, of course, is a very dedicated soprano saxophonist and probably went 15 years without playing the tenor and just played soprano. Right. But Dave reaching all the way back to the beginning of jazz soprano saxophone.
That's right. So he was not trying to copy Bechet's wide vibrato, but he did really find a way to pay tribute to Bechet in a way that was his own voice, but kind of filtered through Bechet's consciousness. It's quite a nice record, and they're all Bechet tunes.
Petite Floor, but I'm not really aware of what else you did on the record.
Yeah, I didn't know any of the tunes. We also did Summertime because Bechet had a hit with that in 1938, and on a few of the tunes, he's actually playing portions of the Bechet solos.
Interesting. Well, John, my last 2 questions to you tonight. The first one is about your original guitar style, and can you give us a brief summation of, you really are different from other guitarists. You're instantly recognizable. What are some of the things, without having to be too feeling like you're boasting, but what would you say mark you? What are the elements that mark you as an individual jazz guitarist?
Well, some people comment on some unusual guitar voicings that sound sort of pianistic. So some of the voicings that I use on the guitar, chord voicing, set me apart a bit. And stylistically, when I solo, I didn't really ever copy anybody exactly. So I really kind of had my own vocabulary, a little like John Abercrombie, in the sense that you don't hear any obvious Wes Montgomery, Joe Pastel, Farlow, much as I love all those guys, or John Scofield or Pat Martino for that matter. I've listened. I didn't really want to copy any, some little voice, and Link Chamberlain encouraged this in me. It's one of his great strengths as a teacher. Just listen, but you don't necessarily have to copy. Some guys say you got to transcribe, you got to copy to get vocabulary, and that is probably accurate and a good advice for most people. But I know that I don't think Abercrombie transcribed, Scofield didn't transcribe, Bill Frisell didn't transcribe, so that's not the path for everybody.
Wow, interesting. So I guess it's some of your voicings, but some of your approach to the guitar makes you, you sound like a modern, straight-ahead guitar player. But when anybody listens to you, even moderately carefully, they hear something different.
Yeah, I think I just tried to find my own way through the chords, my own vocabulary. So I just found it's primarily chord shapes and arpeggios, wider intervals, but again, not sounding exactly like anybody else because I didn't copy anybody.
Sure. John, is your website up to date? Can people go to johnstowell.com and find things?
Yep, you can. Yep. And I've got a YouTube channel and things on various other places too. Lots of things that are not on my YouTube channel that are on YouTube. So I'm easy to reach, and I'm on Facebook too. So anyone likes to reach out, I'm very happy to hear from anybody.
Well, that brings me to my last question, John. I mean, before all this crap happened, I was traveling a lot, but a great amount of it was in the United States. For you, you're one of the most globe-trotting musicians I know. And, age is never a factor. As long as you're healthy, you like being on the road and you're out there. I think I asked you once in Portland, how much are you out there? And I think you said something like about 8 months out of the year. And is that how
for the last 10, I'd say for the last 10 or a dozen years or so, it's been between 7 and 9 months of the year traveling. So
okay, so a very succinct question. the emotional issues aside, creatively, how have you handled being stuck at home for 9 months for the first time in the last 3 or 4 decades?
Yeah, it's actually been better than I thought it would be, thanks to the help of our mutual friend Mike Doolan. And you and I have been doing some playing, and hopefully we're going to
Play
have
some
at
distance
least one
sessions,
more gig. Yeah, yeah.
supporting each
So we're socially distanced, and I'm doing some online lessons and workshops. And I had a couple of courses that just came out that I got done right before the pandemic shut things down in early March with some folks in Florida. Some royalties. So, thankfully my overhead is very low where I live. I'm very fortunate in that sense. I just rent a few rooms in someone's house. You've been over here,
Yes.
and I've lived in this place for almost 20 years. I've been really
So,
very
John,
fortunate
if
to live here.
another musician is out there and they're watching this interview on Live Jazz KC, on a future date after it's posted or in the archive,
hmm
what would be your advice to a musician who is depressed and frustrated right now about what they can do creatively to get through this pandemic and this lockdown when there are essentially no gigs in most parts of the country?
Well, you could use this as a time maybe to build up your online presence, to work on repertoire, to collaborate at least online, or if there's a way to socially distance, play with friends in a big room with masks and a window open, or separate rooms somehow with a recording studio set up with headphones. Just try to create new ways to collaborate. That's what we have to do now. And I think in a sense, it's sort of a silver lining, assuming you stay healthy, because this online presence can be part of our musical lives going forward. And I encourage you to do this too, in terms of building up your online teaching, your presence online while you have some time on your hands.
Well, what I did this morning was I learned the intro to Jobim's Gingy, which I've heard for 30 years and I never learned.
Mhm.
Now I know it.
Yeah,
So
it's a
that
good intro. It's a good intro. I agree.
yes. So that's one little thing you can do. So learning tunes is one way to
Yes,
cope with
absolutely.
the unemployment and the depression and the worry. It's something productive we can do while we're locked down.
And we can support and encourage each other too. Maybe this could be a time to write some tunes. This could be a time to learn repertoire, as you're saying.
Well,
This
man,
could
I've
be a
written
time to work on
19 tunes
technique.
since this shit started. I'm done
There
with
you
that.
go. Okay, well, 19 is good. I think I've only written one, but I have learned quite a bit of new repertoire, some of
There-
which we played together. You've brought in some of the Jobim tunes, and I've learned a bunch of other ones too that I'll keep in my repertoire for sure, not just because of the pandemic.
Actually, about 10 of those tunes were written before the pandemic in 19, but a lot of them have been written
Right,
since. And of course, at
right.
least during this downtime, when you do create a composition or you do encourage another player or you do get to play in a distance situation in a recording studio, you feel productive because there's this scratching for crumbs feeling of, well, at least I did something.
Well, I think, but you realize that the love of the craft is still there, even if we can't play for people or make any money at it. And the love of the craft is, we can hold each other up and support each other through this and do our best. And people will be ready for us when it is safe to play for them again.
Well, one time when I wanted to quit, Lou Soloff told me never think of music as a way to make a living. Think of it as an art form.
Yeah. I think of it as a well-paid hobby, basically,
Right.
but I mean, the love of the craft. Yeah. Even if someone said you'll never make another dime with music, I'm quite sure I'd still pick up the guitar every day.
All right. Well, before we sign off, our producer in Kansas City is Herschel McWilliams. I'm sure he's glad that even though the Chiefs evidently played badly today, they won anyway. So go Kansas
Excellent.
Chiefs and Mahomes. And of course, we're gonna come back in the new year with George Cables. Tell us very quickly, what did you do with George? I forgot to ask you.
Yeah, that might have been just sitting in a few times. I've known him for many years, and he had a wonderful girlfriend for quite a while named Helen Ray, who's an Aussie, and they lived together in San Francisco and then a bit in New York. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. And so I might have even met George through her, but I probably met him in the 70s in San Francisco. And I think we sat in a few times together. I'm not sure if we actually did a gig, but he's always been you hear that kind of joy that I talked about earlier in his playing too.
Well, fair to say that George is really one of the tremendous virtuoso swinging pianists alive today and one of the
I
nicest.
agree.
Yes, a real sweetheart. Oh, I'll tell you what George did for me, and then we'll sign off for the night. Long story short, I was in Honolulu. I was in Hawaii for a while working, and I got it in my head that there was this tune George wrote that I really wanted to play that I knew from a Freddie Hubbard record from the 70s or 80s. And I wrote to him and I said, hey, George, I'm here in Hawaii. I'd really like to play, composition X. And he goes, well, let me look around. Let me try to find it, in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And then later he emailed me all the parts, the bass part, the horn part, the concert part,
Oh, wow.
his own handwriting. And he had gone out to basically a Mailboxes Inc. place in New York City when there was snow on the ground to send this stuff to me. And so
Wow.
that's the kind of sweetheart this is the kind of human being that our friendships through music that we really value. I mean, George Cable's, he and I have known each other since I was 25 years old. We've never been really close. He did this beautiful thing for me, and I was really grateful.
Yeah, but I think we remember that when someone else asks us for a favor, and we try to help each other in this way, because we all know this is not a particularly easy way to make a living, and the love of the craft is what keeps us all engaged.
Right.
Helping each other.
My lifetime right now is the hardest that it's ever been to make a living. During,
I think that's right.
It's
But again, using this as a way to reimagine ourselves and having this online component going forward could be a silver lining, even though it feels tough at the moment.
Sure. Well, John, one last thing. Can you remember anything extremely funny that happened in your career with one of these folks we've talked about?
Funny. Yeah, I'm sure there have been lots of laughs, and like you have been able to recount over the years with your gigs. Let me think if there's one that really stands out.
Well, like the one where Abercrombie was in a car accident where everybody was okay, but their van overturned in Europe, and I think it was with Miroslav Vitus and Paul Motion and Joachim Kuhn and
good band to have an accident with.
Well, John and one of the other guys, they were looking for Joachim after the car crashed, and they couldn't find him. They finally found him, and he's wearing one of those, elegant long hip scarves, and he's smoking a cigarette. And their van is just turned over about 4 minutes earlier, and he says, "Man, I think my groove has been seriously disturbed."
Yeah. Well, that's a fair assessment.
That's the coolest customer on the planet, to be able to smoke and say that after a car accident.
Yep. Well, I have lots of stories, but nothing that comes to mind is particularly hilarious. So we'll save that for the next time.
I think that'll be for next time. So,
okay.
For Improvvo, our little series of jazz interviews here, this interview will be archived permanently. You'll be able to watch it on the Facebook page of Live Jazz KC or on the website, www.livejazzkc.com. Special thanks to our producer here during the holidays, Herschel McWilliams, for doing audio and video and for keeping this series and this website going. And to you, my dear old friend, John Stowell, great guitarist, master musician, gentleman, and gentle icon of the guitar. John, thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure, Rob, and Herschel, great to meet you. And I hope that maybe we can all connect in KC sometime in the future. That would be great fun.
That would be great. John, hang on there. I have a question to ask you, but we're going to end with this is one of your favorite tunes to play in certain contexts, and this is Nardis, written by Bill Evans or Miles Davis or who knows. And this is you with a quartet of gentlemen from Italy, and that's what we're going to hear on the way out. And hang tight.
Okay.
Okay. This has been Convo Improvvo. Rob Scheps with John Stowell. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. I can see it too.